Imagine being told you can't board a flight, not because of security, not because of policy, but because someone doesn't like who you are. That's exactly what happened to Karoline Leavitt, and the cameras caught everything. Karoline Leavitt walked into the bustling terminal of Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, rolling her carry-on behind her. She was used to airports, early morning flights, tight schedules, the occasional lost bag, but today was supposed to be easy. A short flight, nothing unusual. She checked her phone as she moved through the security checkpoint, ignoring the faint murmur of people recognizing her. It came with the territory. Some nodded in approval, others whispered behind her back. That was life in politics. She had long accepted of it. But something about today felt different. At first it was subtle. A few prolonged stares. A hushed conversation between two airline employees near the check-in counters. Nothing she hadn't experienced before. But when she approached her gate, she noticed a flight attendant standing near the boarding area, scanning the crowd as if searching for someone specific. Karoline didn't think much of it. She pulled out her boarding pass, ready to board like any other passenger. The attendant, a woman in her early 30s with a tight ponytail and a name tag that read Melissa J., glanced at Karoline, then did a double take. Her expression hardened. "Hi there," Karoline said, handing over her pass with a polite smile. "Checking in for flight 237. Melissa barely looked at the boarding pass before her eyes flicked back to Karoline's face. A long, deliberate pause, then a forced smile. "I just need to check something really quickly." "One moment," Melissa said. She turned away without another word, walking toward the gate desk. Karoline frowned, glancing at the passengers behind her. The line was moving normally. No extra checks, no unnecessary delays, just her. Her stomach tightened. She stepped aside, watching as Melissa whispered something to another attendant, a younger woman who briefly looked at Karoline before nodding. There was no urgency in their conversation, but there was an exchange of glances that made it clear something was off. A man behind Karoline, middle-aged with a baseball cap and a carry-on slung over his shoulder, cleared his throat. "Everything all right up there?" he asked, looking from Karoline to the flight attendants. "I'm not sure," Karoline admitted, shifting her bag. "Just waiting for them to check something." The man gave her a knowing look, the kind of look that said he had already seen where this was going. Another few moments passed. Then Melissa returned, her forced smile still in place, but her voice colder. "Ms. Leavitt, I'm going to need you to step aside for additional security clearance." Karoline blinked. "Excuse me?" "It's just a precaution," Melissa continued. "We need to verify some information before we can clear you to board." A few heads in the waiting area turned. Karoline could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing on her, but she stayed composed. "What kind of information?" she asked, voice calm but firm. Melissa didn't answer right away. She glanced at the younger attendant, who looked uncomfortable now, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "It's standard protocol," Melissa finally said. "Standard for whom?" Karoline asked, her patience thinning. Melissa hesitated, just for a split second, but that hesitation said everything. Karoline knew this wasn't random. She had taken flights countless times. She knew the process inside and out. If this were a genuine security concern, TSA would be involved. There would be officials, procedures, not a lone flight attendant making vague statements. She glanced at the passengers waiting in line, some pretending not to listen, others openly watching. A few pulled out their phones. People knew when something wasn't right. Karoline inhaled deeply. She had a choice here. She could comply quietly, let this play out, hope it was just a misunderstanding. Or she could challenge it, right here, right now. She looked Melissa in the eye. "I'd like to speak with a supervisor." Melissa's smile faltered, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. Melissa's fingers tightened around the tablet in her hand. For a moment, she said nothing, just held Karoline's gaze like she was daring her to drop it first. A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady hum of airport announcements crackling over the intercom. Then Melissa let out a slow breath, as if Karoline had just asked for something unreasonable. "There's no need for that," she said, tilting her head slightly. "I'm simply following airline policy." Karoline didn't blink. "Then your supervisor won't mind explaining that policy to me." Behind her, the line of passengers waiting to board grew restless. A few shuffled their bags. The man with the baseball cap muttered something under his breath. Further back, a woman in a blazer pulled out her phone, holding it at an angle that suggested she was recording. Melissa noticed. Her lips pressed together before she forced another tight smile. I'll have to ask you to step aside so we don't hold up the line. Karoline crossed her arms. I'll wait right here. The other flight attendant, the younger one, looked visibly uncomfortable now, darting nervous glances between Melissa and the growing crowd. Melissa, she murmured under her breath. Maybe we should. I've got it handled. Melissa cut her off. But she didn't. Karoline could see the slight shift in her expression. She wasn't expecting pushback. Melissa turned, marching toward the small airline podium near the jet bridge. She picked up the radio, murmuring something into it before glancing back at Karoline with thinly veiled irritation. All right, she said, lowering the radio. A supervisor is on their way. But I'll remind you, this is a private airline. We reserve the right to deny boarding to anyone who poses a disruption. A disruption. Karoline let the words sit between them for a moment. She knew exactly what Melissa meant. Am I causing a disruption, or do you just not like me? She asked plainly. A sharp breath, a flicker of something in Melissa's eyes. Not fear, but frustration. Like Karoline had just exposed something she didn't want spoken out loud. That's not what this is about, Melissa said quickly. This is about ensuring all passengers feel safe. Karoline let that sink in. How exactly am I making people unsafe? Melissa hesitated again, but she covered it fast. As I said, policy. That was the moment Karoline realized Melissa was stalling. The whole thing wasn't just about denying her boarding. It was about making her leave on her own. She wanted Karoline to get frustrated, to argue, to make a scene so she could justify removing her. It was a trap, and Karoline wasn't going to step into it. She took a slow breath, then glanced at the people watching. More phones were out now. The tension in the air had shifted. What started as quiet curiosity had now turned into clear skepticism. Passengers were no longer just watching. They were waiting. Then a new voice cut through the noise. What's going on here? A man in a navy blue airline blazer approached, his ID badge clipped to his chest. Gate supervisor, late 40s, graying at the temples. He had the look of someone who'd spent too many years smoothing over airport disputes. Melissa turned, adopting a tone so sweet it was almost jarring. Oh, good, you're here, she said. I was just explaining to Ms. Leavitt that we needed to verify some details before she could board. The supervisor's eyes flicked to Karoline, then to Melissa. He didn't immediately buy it. Verify what details exactly? He asked. Melissa opened her mouth, paused, and in that hesitation, Karoline knew she didn't have an answer. The supervisor looked back at Karoline. Ma'am, has TSA spoken to you? No, Karoline said firmly. Nobody has. Because this isn't about security. The supervisor's frown deepened. He looked at Melissa. Is that true? Melissa's smile had faded completely. She was caught now, and she knew it. We're just being cautious, she tried again. The supervisor's jaw tightened. He turned back to Karoline, this time with a more measured expression. One moment. He gestured for Melissa to step aside, lowering his voice as he spoke to her. Karoline couldn't hear the exchange, but she didn't need to. The body language said it all. Melissa was rigid, arms crossed, her voice clipped and defensive. The supervisor, on the other hand, looked less than impressed. A full minute passed before he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Then he turned back to Karoline. You're cleared to board, Ms. Leavitt. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Melissa looked like she had just swallowed something bitter. But before anyone could move, she spoke again. I still think it's a risk. A risk. Karoline met her eyes. The way Melissa said it, the sharp edge in her voice, the lingering defiance, made it clear. She wasn't talking about safety. She was talking about ideology. And Karoline wasn't going to let that slide. She turned to the supervisor, voice steady. I'd like to file a formal complaint. Melissa flinched, and just like that, the balance of power shifted. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension sat thick in the air, pressing down like the weight of an unspoken truth. Melissa's eyes flickered, just for a second, but it was enough to know she wasn't expecting Karoline to push back. The supervisor exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance. All right, he said, let's step over to the side and we'll... No, Karoline's voice was clear, unwavering. I want to file it now, right here. A murmur swept through the crowd. More passengers had stopped pretending to mind their own business. A woman in a beige trench coat raised her phone higher, definitely recording now. The supervisor hesitated, but he nodded. Understood. I'll make a note of your request. Melissa shifted uncomfortably, her jaw tightening. I'm just following procedure, she muttered, but the confidence she had minutes ago was crumbling. Karoline let the silence stretch between them before speaking. What procedure exactly? Melissa swallowed. Because according to the airline's website, Karoline continued, the only reason a passenger can be denied boarding is if they're a threat, intoxicated, or violating airline policy. I haven't done any of those things. The supervisor glanced at Melissa, his frown deepening. Is that true? Melissa opened her mouth, then closed it. Something inside Karoline settled. She had her cornered, but Melissa wasn't done yet. I have the right to refuse boarding if I feel it's necessary, she said, her voice sharper now, latching on to whatever authority she thought she still had. Passengers have been removed before. Caroline's eyes didn't waver, and I bet they had a valid reason. What's yours? The silence stretched too long, and that's when the shift happened. The passengers had seen enough. The whispers turned into voices. The side glances turned into open stares. The man with the baseball cap from earlier let out a scoff. This is ridiculous, he muttered, shaking his head. A woman a few feet away crossed her arms. She paid for her ticket just like the rest of us. Someone else chimed in. If she's not a security risk, then what's the problem? Melissa's face turned red. She had lost the crowd. She must have realized it too, because she suddenly stepped forward, addressing the supervisor instead of Karoline. I still think she's a disruption, she said, voice lower but still laced with frustration. The supervisor looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Karoline. Ms. Leavitt, he said, you are cleared to board this flight. The tension snapped like a rubber band. Karoline exhaled, steadying herself. She had known this would happen. If she just stood her ground, the truth would come out. But then, Melissa did something no one expected. She stepped in front of the boarding lane, physically blocking the entrance. The crowd gasped. Someone let out a low, shocked whistle. Even the supervisor looked taken aback. Melissa's hands clenched into fists. She had lost control of the situation, and she knew it. She's a disruption, she repeated. I have the right. No, the supervisor cut in, his voice firmer this time. You don't. Melissa turned to him, face twisting. You're just going to let her on? The supervisor's patience had worn thin. You're done here. A silence heavier than the last one settled over the gate. Melissa's eyes flickered with disbelief, like she couldn't comprehend what was happening. But reality hit fast. The supervisor motioned toward another employee behind the desk. Escort her to the office. Melissa's lips parted, her breath shaky. You're firing me? The supervisor's jaw tensed. I'm placing you under review. Melissa let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. But she didn't argue. She knew she had pushed too far. And as the younger flight attendant hesitantly stepped up to take her place, Melissa turned one last time to Karoline. Her face was blank now. No smile, no fake warmth, just quiet resentment. She walked away without another word. The gate attendant cleared her throat, stepping forward with a small, nervous smile. Boarding group 3, you're welcome to board now. Karoline took one last look at the faces around her, some still holding their phones, some just watching, waiting for what she'd do next. Then she picked up her carry-on, and without looking back, she stepped onto the jet bridge. The air inside the jet bridge felt different, not just from the contrast between the terminal and the aircraft cabin, but because of everything that had just happened. Karoline inhaled deeply, rolling her shoulders back as she stepped onto the plane. She wasn't rattled, not outwardly at least, but there was something about the way Melissa had dug in her heels, the way she refused to let go, that stuck with her. She wasn't the first public figure to deal with something like this, and she probably wouldn't be the last. A flight attendant inside the aircraft, a different one, thankfully, greeted her with a polite nod. No tension, no forced smiles, just a professional doing her job. Welcome aboard, Ms. Leavitt. Karoline gave a small nod in return and made her way to her seat. She barely had time to buckle in before a man in a navy blazer stepped onto the plane, followed closely by 2 other airline officials. Senior management. The murmurs started almost immediately. Passengers from the gate had followed her onto the flight, some still whispering about what had just happened. The man in the blazer, name tag read Daniel Reese, regional supervisor, stopped at Karoline's row. Ms. Leavitt, he said, voice measured but professional. May I have a moment of your time? Karoline didn't move. Right here is fine. A flicker of hesitation. He was expecting her to follow him off the plane, but she wasn't budging. So he adjusted his stance, nodding slightly. I was just briefed on what happened at the gate, he started, hands clasped in front of him. I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced. Karoline raised an eyebrow. Inconvenience? Another murmur rippled through the cabin. Reese exhaled through his nose. The employee in question has been removed from duty pending review. This is not how we operate. Karoline studied him for a beat. His words were smooth but carefully measured, the kind of corporate speak designed to acknowledge without admitting fault. She leaned back in her seat, folding her arms. What exactly is being reviewed? She asked. Reese hesitated, just slightly, but Karoline caught it. Then he did something she didn't expect. He glanced around the cabin, clearly aware that every word he said was being absorbed by passengers who weren't going to forget this moment anytime soon. Then he lowered his voice. I understand why you're upset, he said, and I can assure you this will be handled internally. Karoline let that sit for a second. Then she tilted her head. Handled how? Reese's jaw tensed slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. Melissa J. knowingly and deliberately tried to prevent me from boarding, Karoline said, her voice steady but firm. Not for security reasons, not for safety, but because she didn't like me. Reese didn't deny it. I need to know, Karoline continued, her voice now reaching the other passengers. How often does this happen? How many people get removed from flights without the cameras rolling? The tension in the cabin thickened. Passengers were listening now, not just out of curiosity, but with real interest. Reese knew it. He exhaled sharply, then leaned in just slightly. This was a mistake, he said, lowering his voice again. And we're going to make it right. A pause. Will she be fired? Karoline asked, point blank. Reese's lips pressed together. He couldn't answer that. Not here. Not in front of witnesses. So instead, he straightened his back, slipping back into that corporate mask. Internal review processes are confidential, he said smoothly. But I can promise you, we take this very seriously. Karoline studied him for another beat. Then she nodded. Good, she said, because I do too. Reese held her gaze for a moment longer before clearing his throat. If you need anything else during your flight, don't hesitate to let the crew know. And just like that, he turned and walked off the plane. The murmurs started up again. Passengers exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, others looking as though they had just witnessed something bigger than a simple airport dispute. And as Karoline settled into her seat, she had the distinct feeling that this wasn't over, not even close. The plane touched down at Nashville International Airport, but Karoline barely had time to retrieve her luggage before her phone exploded with notifications. News alerts, texts, missed calls. She tapped one of the notifications, a viral video. It was grainy, shot from a passenger's phone, but it captured everything. The standoff at the gate, the way Melissa refused to let her board, the moment the supervisor overruled her. And most damning of all, the look on Melissa's face when she realized she had lost. The caption beneath it was blunt. Flight attendant tries to deny boarding to conservative figure Karoline Leavitt, gets overruled and removed. Karoline scrolled further. The video had already racked up over 2 million views. It wasn't just going viral, it was everywhere. On Twitter, hashtags like #FireMelissa, #bias in the sky, and #accountability matters were trending. Some users called for an immediate investigation into airline policies. Others demanded Melissa's termination. And then there was the airline's official Twitter account, scrambling to do damage control. Their statement was short, almost robotic. We are aware of the incident involving a gate agent and a passenger at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. We take these matters seriously and are conducting a full review. We do not condone discrimination of any kind. But nobody was buying it. The comments were brutal. You don't condone discrimination, but it happened at your gate, on your watch. She was caught on camera. Don't review it. Fire her. So what happens to the passengers? This happens to off camera. It wasn't just public pressure. Legal experts had already jumped in. Some pointed out potential lawsuits for discrimination. Others noted that Karoline might have grounds to take legal action. And just when Karoline thought the backlash couldn't get worse for the airline, it did. That evening, a second video surfaced, one from a different angle, closer, clearer. And this one caught something the first video didn't. Melissa standing at the gate with her arms crossed, muttering something under her breath as Karoline walked away. It was barely audible, but the internet did what the internet does best: enhanced the audio, slowed it down, and pulled out the words. I don't let people like her on my plane. The moment it hit social media, the firestorm tripled. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. This was personal. And now the airline had no choice but to act. By the next morning, reporters were camped outside both the airline's corporate offices and Melissa's home. The airline's PR team had to move fast, faster than they wanted to. A new statement dropped. After a thorough internal review, the employee involved in the recent incident at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport has been terminated, effective immediately. We reaffirm our commitment to fair treatment for all passengers, regardless of political beliefs. The internet exploded. Some cheered, others said it wasn't enough. But the reality was Melissa had done this to herself. She wasn't just out of a bomb, she was infamous. And as Karoline watched the fallout unfold from her hotel room, sipping her morning coffee, she realized something. Melissa had tried to make her a lesson, but in the end, she was the one who got schooled. Karoline set her phone down, letting the endless stream of updates scroll by on their own. She had been in the public eye long enough to know how these things played out. A scandal erupts, outrage spreads, and before long, someone becomes the scapegoat. This time, that person was Melissa. And yet, as satisfying as it was to see accountability delivered, Karoline couldn't shake a nagging thought. How many times had this happened before without cameras rolling? She had the platform, the influence, and the audience to fight back when she was unfairly treated. But what about the everyday travelers? The ones who didn't have millions of people watching? How many had been turned away for reasons that would never make the news? A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find an older woman, early 60s, standing there with a cautious smile. She was dressed simply, jeans, a sweater, a tote bag slung over one shoulder. Ms. Leavitt, she said warmly, I hope I'm not interrupting, but I just wanted to say thank you. Karoline blinked. For what? The woman let out a small chuckle. For standing up for yourself, for standing up for all of us. She shifted the tote bag on her shoulder. I fly a lot, and I've seen things like this happen before. Not as obvious as what happened to you, but enough to make you feel like you're not welcome, like you're being punished for thinking a certain way. Karoline studied her, seeing the genuine emotion behind her words. I just want you to know, the woman continued, people are watching, and we appreciate what you did. For the first time since stepping off that plane, Karoline felt a real sense of resolution. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. Melissa had tried to use her as an example, to send a message that people like her weren't welcome. But in the end, the message that actually got sent was a different one entirely. People weren't just going to sit back and let this kind of thing happen anymore. The woman gave her one last nod, then stepped back. I won't take up any more of your time. Just wanted to say my piece. Karoline smiled. I'm glad you did. The door closed, and Karoline sat back down, her coffee now lukewarm. Her phone was still lighting up, but this time she wasn't interested in the noise. She already knew how this story ended. Not with anger, not with gloating, but with a reminder that sometimes all it takes is one person standing their ground to remind the rest of the world to do the same. If you believe in fairness, in holding people accountable, and in standing up for what's right, share this story. Let people see what happens when bias goes unchecked and why it's more important than ever to speak up when it does. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories that matter, because the fight for fairness isn't just happening in headlines. It's happening in everyday moments, just like this one.